Well, we've got a lot to get through, so I think we'll start. Before we kick stuff off, this session's going to be recorded, so if you don't want to appear in the recording, feel free to switch off your webcam. And yeah, I think we'll go. So hi, everyone. Welcome to this session run by Fair Impact on Trust Resources for Repositories. This session will be run by my colleague Hervé Laws and myself. Both of us are based at the UK Data Archive, which is located at the University of Essex and is the lead partner in delivering the UK Data Service. The UK Data Service is also the UK's service provider for the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives, CESDA. If we go to the next slide, please, Hervé. So a very brief introduction to the Fair Impact project. We're a Horizon Europe funded project, which builds on the previous FAIR's FAIR project. It began in June 2022 and runs to May 2025. If we go to the next slide. In essence, the project is working to support the vision of the European Science Cloud, where fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data can be shared and reused. If we go to the next slide. So this session on trust will be recorded and added to the website. So like I mentioned at the beginning, feel free to turn off your camera if you don't want to be recorded. It will cover free resources and highlight several others. The free resources are RDA's descriptive attributes of research data repositories, CoreTrustSeal and FAIRenabling capability maturity model, and the metadata and data services activities and functions. Please feel free to add any questions to the chat and we'll come back to them at the end. There'll also be a survey near the end of the session where we'll be able to pick some resources to explore at the end of the session. So without further ado, on to Hervé.
Thanks, Ollie. Hi, everyone. I'm coming down with a cold, so you'll have to forgive me in advance. So the overview of the sessions in front of you there, we will try and keep this quite tight given the number of attendees and see if we can allow a little bit more time for sort of Q&A and discussion at the end. We'll go through the various resources. There'll be opportunity to select some topics that you'd like to drill down further into and which we'll pick up any additional questions we can with the chat, and as time allows, we'll pull those additional questions together at the end, and we'll follow up on anything we don't get to afterwards, just to make sure that everyone gets some sort of response over the next couple of weeks as we close out the workshop program. So I'm going to open with trusted versus trustworthiness. I mean, trust is the underlying concept here, confidence and belief in the reliability or truth of something, offered, sought and accepted between two parties. But when we choose to trust, we may turn out to be right or wrong. The slightly narrower definition of trustworthiness is about demonstrating that practices meet a set of standard requirements. And this can include through an assessment process based on evidence. The underlying thing here is that transparency really is a dependency for that trust to happen effectively. So the scope of work and the activities we're doing here today, we will be focusing on the repositories themselves, but we'll be making this relevant as possible to wider organizations and data services working in research infrastructures and be very inclusive of digital objects. But the underlying idea is that you learn about yourself by reference to some sort of more or less standard criteria, so you can assess needs, plan and deliver for improved trust through transparency. We've got a number of resources here. As Ollie said, we've got a couple of bits of background and context information here. The CoreTrustSeal board have released a set of curation and preservation levels. That's a current position paper, which has led to a repository typology paper, looking at those entities and their responsibilities and the objects they hold. That's a discussion paper. There'll be links for all this later as well. And that's led to a working paper on implied repository and object metadata characteristics, which kind of support the presentation, the transparency, and eventually the evaluation as well. But the three main resources that we're going through today, as Ollie said, first of all, we've got the RDA common descriptive attributes, 17 high-level attributes about repositories. Then we'll look at the CoreTrustSeal plus FAIRenabling capability maturity model, those 16 CoreTrustSeal requirements mapped to the 15 FAIR principles. with a method of doing a kind of a readiness assessment about information and evidence. And finally, the metadata and data services, activities and functions, which gives a broader view of repositories and data services and what they do. So we've tried to do this so it's inclusive of the above. The links are there, both to the CoreTrustSeal and the extended guidance we provide as well. The metadata and data services, activities and functions is based on a crosswalk, across a bunch of different criteria. The published version and the current edit version are provided there. Now, we did this originally as a pick and mix session for reusing and recycling existing stuff, selecting what works for you and taking what you need. It occurred to me that maybe being able to buy lots of sweets from different buckets and pay for them by the pound wasn't an internationally recognized concept. So we can also think of this about working out how to become trust cocktail mixologists and bring all of this together to meet your local needs for the perfect flavor. The underlying piece in this transparency for trust relationship here is from two key perspectives. The first one, and for me, the priority one, is internal, mutual understanding between people, consistent practice, and continuous improvement is what we're looking for. Now, once we've tidied that all up and shared it with the outside world, we get the external benefits: interoperability with third parties, communications with our stakeholders, essentially our funders as well, clarity for depositors and users. And the idea behind a lot of this is the information artifacts that are sufficient for a sustainable service should be sufficient for assessment and certification. So you should be sharing information that you already need to do a decent job inside the building. Yeah. So apart from tidying it up for external consumption, you can hope that most of this stuff should be useful to you, not just for transparency. The opening question is who you are. As I said, we're looking mainly at repositories, considering their responsibilities in the framework of trustworthiness and transparency. And we mentioned the CoreTrustSeal curation and preservation levels. They're presented briefly here in this diagram. And here in the wider concept of the research lifecycle, you'll see some more of this later, from the conceive, create, collect phase into the beginning of the repository phase for deposit and appraisal, through initial curation, discovery and identification, access, and eventually reuse. And one way to think about your responsibilities and duties as a repository is through these levels. As you can see, the CoreTrustSeal places this sort of Z level, content distributed as deposited, a retention-only repository effectively, and then builds the levels on top of that in terms of deposit compliance. Do you set criteria at the point of deposit for accepting digital objects? Do you undertake initial curation before you provide initial access to make sure that those objects meet a certain level of quality? And do you offer active preservation for the data and metadata over time? And beyond the levels, the typology kind of flips this on the head, as you can see here, and presents a range of repositories from retention only at this level and shows them building up through deposit compliance, initial curation, and active preservation, with each stage inclusive and contiguous with the previous stages in the repository. So guidance on the transparency piece, we're looking at transparent sharing of relevant repository and object information. So what activities and functions do you undertake? What characteristics do you have about the repository and the digital objects? And what artifacts do you present, from policies to procedures to reference information, right from deposit, curation, and active preservation? Standards-based for harvesting and validation here is we are looking for things that are standards compliant, ideally for use by humans and machines, which support assertions about a repository or objects and the validation of those assertions afterwards. And the connection here is the repository for trust and the FAIR digital objects that they hold. We've got a very broad object model here for the digital objects, the data, the metadata as the structured information, and maybe the less structured documentation that supports that. But that data definition there is inclusive of research data, of software, workflows, publications. So these really are sort of codependent concepts here. The repository contains objects with a number of different characteristics. And these objects imply a number of characteristics at the object level. Depending on your objects, this will influence your collection policy, the skills you need to have as an organization, and the scope of depositors and users that will be using your repository. This is not only about depositing information in an appropriate repository, but also finding it at the other end as well. So the idea is that a repository enables appropriate retention, deposit criteria, curation, and preservation, and any number of other kind of characteristics that are seen as important for the organization, including but not limited to FAIR. But the other principles you'll have probably seen in the acronym world recently are the trust principles and certainly the care principles as well. All of these factor into the considerations. What sort of characteristics do you want the objects to have at the end of the curation process and ongoing through the preservation process? So more deeply within that area of repository responsibility, for object X, we are looking at this object data and metadata. We're looking to the object-to-object relationships, whether those be other publications, contextual information, previous versions and subsequent versions, but also the process metadata about, what's been done to the object during the course of its life cycle, and a number of business information artifacts. And that mixture of information about the object, process metadata, and business information provide kind of evidence that you could be transparent about, which would support assessment. Now, those business information artifacts, they could be local or they could be third-party, policies, standard operating procedures, other sorts of reference information, selected standards, and obviously legislation as well. And across the repository's high-level focus, you'll see a pretty common division of looking at the different aspects of this. Organizational infrastructure in terms of kind of sustainability, governance, and effectiveness, the digital object management itself through that lifecycle process, and the underlying technology and whatever's done to assess and ensure security as well. And each of these has impact on and intersects across retention, those deposit criteria, initial curation, active preservation, and again, the reappraisal of how the objects are cared for over time. Now, looking at the criteria that we expect to be able to see about the objects, that the objects demonstrate, the clear focus here is FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which breaks down into a number of different implied requirements overall. Now, they're very object focused, the FAIR principles in theory, but there's huge dependencies on what the repositories can do to offer functionality and enable FAIR over time. And the other aspect of the FAIR principles is that they're very time insensitive. Yeah, they're very much about describing an object as a snapshot in time. We know that the world changes around those objects and the requirements change too. So how do we ensure that those objects remain FAIR is a critical factor. There's no real argument about the 4 letters of FAIR. They've certainly caught on in a big way. The additional depth of those 15 principles shows that they're a little bit more complicated than when you first glance at them. The RDA working group has developed 40+ indicators to support those. And we know there are a bunch of tools out there at the moment, whether they're sort of practical technical tools or guidance, with a range of metrics around those sort of measurements for the principles themselves, which employ a bunch of different tests in a bunch of different ways. So there are multiple tiers that we need to consider from the repository perspective in terms of enabling the fairness. And the other one of those additional resources that I mentioned before was the implied repository and object metadata stuff that comes out of those curation levels and those repository types. There are a number of implied repository and object level metadata characteristics. This includes retention periods, which aren't always as transparent as they could be, but also clear indications about what deposit metadata is required, what deposit formats are acceptable, and the scope of the curation and preservation actions that would be undertaken by the repository. These could include kind of logical, technical format migration, or the provision of emulation environments, Semantic work, updating metadatas and schema and ontologies and all their content over time, and other different quality aspects of digital objects dependent on the criteria up to and including FAIR. And obviously clarity as well on reappraisal times and outcomes, so that we all know how long a digital object will be there and how long it will be cared for at that level of care, and what happens to it when that level of care or level of custody changes over time. So in terms of these resources, first of all, we come to the RDA Common Descriptive Attributes of Research Data Repositories, 17 high-level attributes about repositories. These range from organizational information at the top level, the URL, the language, the country and the context, through to information about things like machine interoperability, terms of deposit, certification, preservation. These are all derived from the Data Repository Attributes Working Group, which has delivered these to date and will continue to work on these in the future. And what was provided during the earlier stages of the FAIR Impact project as an exercise worksheet. There's a link there, and they'll be available in the resources to take you through the draw guidance and some FAIR Impact questions, which were used in a variety of support programs. And that's how they're held together in the diagram. So for each one, we start off with using repository name as the example here, with the attribute itself, the repository name, a description of that attribute, some examples from the real world, schemata where that attribute might be structured and made available in a machine actionable way, and a number of notes on the challenges and issues of that object. And key to the bottom of this, again, is this gap analysis, the draw group's assessment across a bunch of repositories about how easy or difficult it was to find this information across a bunch of repositories, presumably at the human level rather than the machine level initially, but both of those are relevant. So the FAIR Impact questions, which we use for the support programs, covered, asking people to describe the related information and provide links to it, how much that information is available locally, whether it's human and machine actionable, is it structured data, can it be read by machines, and whether it would be possible to assess the assertion through a validation test. That might be the presence or absence of a URL or a policy at the other end of a link. So once they've done that, the idea is to look for future improvement and added value. So, considering how you improve the sharing of information about the attribute, how it would improve communications with humans and machines, how it would improve validation, and obviously whether or not it's a priority for your organization and how much time and effort it would take. So also stealing other examples from other repositories is always a good idea. So going back to those attributes overall, each of these is presented in the support materials and run through in detail. And the idea is that you can work your way through each of those items, considering how you would identify and improve the provision of this information. And we'll cover some more of these in depth later. The second item on the list is the CoreTrustSeal and FAIRenabling capability maturity model, which came originally out of the FAIR project. 16 requirements mapped to 15 principles and a readiness assessment. This comes out of some of the trustworthy digital repository standards. The baseline for a lot of this is the OIS reference model, which is an ISO standard. ISO 16363, or previously called TRAC, is in there too. And DIN 31644, the Nestor seal, a German standard, is also there. We're referencing here the CoreTrustSeal. There's a link to the extended guidance there. This was created as a result of a Research Data Alliance remit to create a single core level, low barrier to entry TDR standard and a supporting sustainable mechanism for the service, with 16 requirements across those rather familiar headings of organizational infrastructure, digital object management, technology, and security. Now, the key factor about CoreTrustSeal, which is why those levels make a difference, is that they're about time and change of people, processes, and technology. So to be in scope, you need to be looking for a sustainable, trustworthy repository data service offering active preservation, which is necessary to maintain those digital objects over time. Active preservation being making them usable and understandable by a defined designated community of users. Now, CoreTrustSeal has been adopted to date by the World Data System for their regular members, for Clarin B centers, and for the CESDA service providers. There are sort of 120 plus certified repositories at the moment. But what we've done here is start to pull these together. We've mapped them into the FAIR data principles to look at how you are a FAIR enabling TDR. And they've been aligned with a capability maturity model, which you may know CMMI. It's as close as possible to the CMMI model, which is the formal model for maturity model. It was developed during the FAIR project, but under FAIR Impact, we've updated it to the new CoreTrustSeal requirements. So the idea is there's a self-assessment against the requirements. You assign a current capability level, prioritize what you want to work on, assign a target capability level, take some action, and then repeat the self-assessment to see how you've done. And this is across those 16 CoreTrustSeal requirements. And as with the draw, you'll see these kind of reappear at the later stage as we start to pull all of these together into something that hopefully you can drill down through, from the repository characteristics to the object characteristics, from those higher level functions down to the lower level requirements, and to those little details that are relevant to you in your local environment. And to do that, we've delivered the FAIR to CoreTrustSeal mapping here. There's two perspectives on this, and this is from FAIR itself into those different CoreTrustSeal requirements over time and how they're aligned. And the overall goal here is to look at how we are FAIR enabling as an organization. One of them is to consider how fair the object is on arrival in the repository, which your mileage may vary on what the quality is at that point, but maintaining existing levels of FAIR on deposit, increasing those levels of FAIR wherever possible, and avoiding any actions which would reduce fairness as a repository. So fairly standard custody and responsibility for the object to meet a certain level of quality criteria. And the final element of this is to look at capability and maturity. Now, unlike some of the capability maturity models, which present just a generic score about the overall detail of the organizational capability, which gets very complicated very quickly, this CapMap model really is about the information artifacts and your readiness in terms of having them documented and organized in the organization so that you can build a capability maturity environment. So the three first tiers of this are initial, where you're aware of the scope and of the issues within the area of focus. And the area of focus in this case is the requirement or principle that you're looking at. And lists of all items relevant to the area of focus exist. Initial is we've got a big list and we know what we're dealing with here. The second tier is managed, so the processes and procedures and other implementation measures are in place for all items on the list. You really got this written down, you know what you'll do, and you can do it consistently for each one of those areas of focus. And the next area defined is when for each of those areas of focus, for each requirement, for each activity or function, you integrate this into a wider organizational policy and practice plan. So you work all of these things together so they're not in conflict with each other, so that they align, and so that they don't deprecate each other's work, and so that they don't disagree. So it's an overall organizational level. And those are the first three tiers of the capability maturity. Now, the model does go beyond this. Beyond the level of managed, you've got a fully defined and integrated organization, which would allow you to have all of the business information out there to reach level 4, which is quantitatively managed. So literally looking at the numbers, seeing benchmarking performance and increasing those benchmarks based on a quantitative approach. At level 5, there is optimizing, where in one or more areas you're constantly improving. So continuous improvement is something you'll see in the ISO standards as well. as one of those goals you're supposed to demonstrate as an organization seeking ISO standards, or in this case, organizational maturity. We've said this before and we'll say it again. In a lot of this work, unless you're incredibly mature, don't worry about the maturity for now. Look at those 3 defined levels of capability in each of the areas that you've got to. If you can reach initial, managed, and defined in any one area across all the areas, then you can consider maturity in a little bit more detail. And the argument for focusing on 1, 2, and 3 really is that if you've got incredibly efficient rights management, but incredibly poor information security, you've got bigger problems than maturity. Reaching that managed and defined level across the board really is a goal. And the point of this, and in fact, the point of a lot of this other work here, is to just start a conversation. Yeah. So who are the expert colleagues you need to identify to start that conversation? Review the CoreTrustSeal requirements and their FAIRenabling items, complete the capability maturity template, and inevitably find gaps that you want to work on. Fill those gaps through preparing documentation and evidence, and repeat. And if everything's cool, well, great. Prepare self-assessment statements. The final goal on here is apply CoreTrustSeal, but here we're pick and mixing. We're not looking at having to go for certification or anything like that. Even without the detailed process of assessment and review, it really is worthwhile going through these items just to start an internal conversation. For me, the first and biggest benefit of doing the CoreTrustSeal and looking at the FAIR stuff was that it gave me a baseline to go and talk to a variety of different people in my organization, from my directors down to my sort of developers and the people that ran our storage. It was a passport to a number of quite interesting conversations that help us bring things together. And in the templates that are provided with the resources, it really is just a question of saying, look at the CoreTrustSeal to FAIR principle alignment, collect your evidence link, make a current capability maturity assessment, select a target, and work towards that. So the final item that we've got on here now is the metadata and data services activities and functions. This was born out of some work that we did at the UK Data Service, where we already have to comply with the Digital Economy Act rules under the UK for handling sensitive data. We're an ISO 27000 repository. We're a kind of CoreTrustSeal repository. We were previously a data seal approval repository. There really are quite a wide range of bits of information and evidence that we're expected to provide, either to meet more or less informal assessments or KPIs or whatever. And as we saw more and more standards and criteria appearing, we're just trying to work our way through and consider how best we organize those together to make our internal business information management efficient to meet as many different needs as possible. And it's a pretty big list, but there's 29 of them. So we consider this to be fairly manageable. And around the outside there, you can see those key stakeholders, the researchers, funders, partners, and others on top. At one end of the life cycle, you can see those metadata and data producers, owners, and depositors serving the metadata users at the end. And at the bottom, you'll see also the support and training functions, not part of any certification model, but what we consider essential to supporting peer repository and metadata and data services, as well as those other stakeholders. And the breakdown here, and you'll see that this again follows that organizational digital object management, security, and technology perspective. Again, this will be familiar from before. This is the life cycle that appears here. We've got very close alignment with CoreTrustSeal. Each of these that's got an orange border on it is either directly or peripherally associated with CoreTrustSeal, with conceive, create, collect, and access added to give us a more complete life cycle and to reflect some of the requirements beyond CoreTrustSeal that are out there. And then the familiar storage and integrity, and as part of the technical infrastructure and security, referencing both information security and physical security of the organization. And at the top there, you'll see the organizational infrastructure. This is not about every one of these things being certified or certifiable. It's covered by the orange items here. These are things that different sets of criteria have considered to be important for an organization in one way or another, whether it be external engagement, R&D, interoperability, release and publishing of your information, assessment and improvement, policies and standards, and critically for a lot of places, analysis of practices and how they impact to demonstrate the value of the service. So how do we get to this? No one's expected to look at this in detail at the moment, but we're very happy to hear feedback on this. What we did was we created this superset based on working through a range of other standards and criteria that are out there at the moment to try and work out how we pull those together. So these range from FAIRenabling to the desirable characteristics of federal repositories in the States, various National Institutes of Health standards, the Coalition of Open Access Repositories, a large piece that FAIR did on service assessment, and the NDSA levels of preservation matrix. So we've tried to pull as much as we can in here to help us kind of address multiple topics from a single higher level perspective. And thankfully, this results in something that's a little simpler, which is the MADSAP heading mapped to the CoreTrustSeal there, which is the R identifier, a brief description. And the ongoing work here, which we're very happy to hear more about, is what metadata characteristics, information artifacts, and evidence you might create and be transparent about under this particular activity or function heading. So this example here is for discovery and identification. And through CoreTrustSeal, we've pulled some of this together at the functions and activities level, and through FAIR Impact, we're now trying to drill down into a number of different further crosswalks. So this is where you see all of this pulling together in a way that hopefully you can pick and mix to your heart's content for what you feel is the correct perspective, whether that be the repository or the object or the activity and function. So we've got here, and these are the supported resources. This is the ongoing sort of open live link to this. We're very happy to have people sort of comment and add details to that. So the heading for the MADSAP is mapped to a CoreTrustSeal, which is mapped to the desirable repository attributes working group outcomes, in this case, persistent identifiers support discovery and identification. And we've mapped through partners on FAIR Impact this into the Re3 data schema, which is the repository registry. And there you can also see the FAIRenabling map. And that's specifically the CoreTrustSeal map, which is, if you look at the stuff, which will be slightly different for different perspectives. So there we go. I said I'd try and keep this quite tight, but hopefully comprehensible. We're looking for this pick and mix to be able to reuse and recycle, to select what works and use what you need. There is no overall goal here to reach certification. You should be able to pick these apart and see where the local benefits are. And hopefully we've pulled this together in a way that doesn't necessarily super simplify, but at least makes a complex space a little bit more accessible than it was. For the RDA DROG, yeah, I mean, we're looking for people to use this and feedback both on the FAIR approach, the questions, as well as the attributes themselves. There will be future work from the DROG working group as well. I'd be very happy to hear from that. For the CoreTrustSeal and FAIRenabling capability maturity model, there'll be a CoreTrustSeal revision next year. So there'll be a possibility to input in that. But it's a basis for planning and implementation. Yeah. So certification is possible for active preservation repositories, but it does apply and is useful across a much wider range of data and metadata services. And finally, for that data, metadata and data services, activities and functions, the links are all provided. Do take a copy. You can just use that locally. And we're very happy to see comments added to the shared file. And we'll be giving appropriate credit as we update that and release it over time. And talking of time, we're at 14:35. That's a little bit more of a reasonable coverage. I know that there are a lot of people here. I really want to be able to open this up for questions at the end. We've decided that what we'll do is having looked at pulling all these together and the alignment between the three approaches, we're looking at picking them apart, mixing resources to meet your local needs. So what we're going to do, and I'll read through the list, and there'll be a poll will pop up when I stop sharing my screen at the moment, assuming I can find the screen sharing button. What we'll do is ask you to select what you'd like to drill down a little bit more into. We'll try and pick and choose between these. We've chosen a bunch of items which are closely aligned across all of the items that you've seen today to maybe discuss a little bit more. We'll jump in with any specific questions that we've got in the chat. Please do add more questions into the chat as you go along. And then we'll try to get to any additional questions at the end. Time will inevitably be short, so if we don't, then rest assured we'll get to your questions afterwards. So the items that are going to pop up for you shortly to choose from are deposit and appraisal, curation, quality and compliance, discovery and identification, reuse, preservation, mission and scope, and rights management. And if I stop sharing, I think I will be able to share.
The joining information. Oh, there we go. So if everyone would like to go to wooclap.com and use the code ZYTSJH, I think it's going to get added to the chat. You'll be able to choose which topics you want covered first. We might have time to get to all of them. I've taken note of several questions and discussion points in the chat, so if we're on the relevant activity, we'll cover them then. If not, we should be able to cover them afterwards. I mean, that sounds good, Hervé. So I'll give a few more minutes for the votes to start flowing in. It looks like they're slowing down a bit. So do we want to start with curation, quality and compliance, Hervé?
Yep, sure, I can do that. I will go through the process of sharing my screen again. If you can unshare that one. You got me?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Yeah, and if there's anything specific to this in there that you'd like to shout me towards, Ollie, then I'm very happy to do that.
Yeah.
The creation, quality and compliance piece is the initial stage of work by the repository on arrival, and it's differentiated from the deposit process itself, where there can be other criteria set. So basically, it's steps taken by the metadata service to ensure digital objects reach a defined level of quality and standards compliance before they're made available for access and reuse. This maps into the CoreTrustSeal's quality assurance piece and to Droog's curation piece. Now, in terms of the characteristics and artifacts, we're looking at sort of documentation of any initial curation steps taken at the point of deposit to meet those defined criteria. Now, that might be for initial access. It might be for consider reuse. We can look at reuse as well, and potentially to enable preservation. What you do will kind of depend on the level of repository service that you're offering. And that includes recording any curation steps like conversions to different file formats and any additions to the metadata that might be taken by the repository. Also, in some repositories with a very close relationship to their depositors, down to the level of making changes to data or variables even, though that is by far from universal. So we're looking at quality and standard statements, compliance standards, operating procedures, and set quality criteria. Also at this point, and across a variety of the different requirements across deposit, this and preservation and reuse, we're probably looking at any limitations on file formats for deposit and preservation. What was the next one on our list, Ollie?
Sorry, so the next one was preservation.
So we did over the last year or so a task force for the European Open Science Cloud Association, a long-term preservation task force. And one of the things we found, and one of the things that's been found on CoreTrustSeal, is that preservation itself is a very wide banner. It's used in a variety of different ways. And one of the targets here is not to deprecate or see as less important some of the services that don't necessarily offer active preservation. But here we're talking about those measures that are taken after initial access, sort of quite specifically. So that's one of the reasons that the levels exist, is to be a little bit more specific about the different services that are being offered. So in this case, it includes monitoring the technology landscape and the user community. So looking for changes in technology and to the needs of the user over time. And then, if necessary, preservation actions are taken. One of the feedback on the levels from the Digital Preservation Coalition was that, maybe it gives the impression that everything needs to be changed as soon as it arrives in the repository. I think it's just sort of generalized normalization. That's not necessarily the case, and your local mileage will vary. But one of the common things that might happen is format migration to something that's friendlier for your users or easier to preserve. But it's not just about the data itself and the data side, it's also about the metadata, updating either the versions of the schemas that you're using over time or updating the content as ontologies change over time, as people use different language and ideas to search for and within the digital objects. And it's not just format migration either, it's emulation environments, a very common way of improving the rendering and use of digital objects. But the idea is that each preservation action is there to deliver a defined preservation outcome, the continued viability of the digital object. Whether you do this or not might depend about whether or not you're just a retention repository, whether you care about reuse, or whether or not you've got active long-term preservation responsibilities. But the underlying idea for this, and you can see for each of these, there's a mapping into the FAIR principles themselves. The underlying idea is that things don't necessarily stay fair if they started fair. The FAIR mapping here is metadata accessible even when the data are no longer available. The strong implication for this, I think, is that some sort of tombstoning position should be in place, some sort of forward planning for the object. In terms of characteristics and artifacts, everything from preservation policies to strategies to the particular approaches to reuse and emulation, and for CVs and ontology. But as I've said, the CoreTrustSeal curation and preservation levels and types come in pretty strongly here as well.
Yep, so I think we've got a few questions on this that come up in the chat earlier. Martin's also got his hand up, so I don't know if you want to kickstart the questions on preservation, Martin.
Yeah, it's not directly related to preservation, but to this point A2, metadata is accessible even when the data is not accessible. And I have a bit of a problem that in the FAIR requirements, and also here you see meta in parentheses, as though metadata and data is almost the same. And I wonder whether this could be a bit more clarified at some point in the future, because I think metadata and data are very different beasts.
Yes, but I mean, yeah, I find so. I think the provision in the original FAIR data principles was the fact that if it says metadata as it does here, it means metadata, a separate thing, and if it says brackets meta brackets data, it means data and metadata, which is, and we have a problem with that locally because it says, it implies that data and metadata should have a separate identifier, but we don't. We've got a single PID which describes the whole digital object that we look after. Yeah, so this is, so there are, I think the lack of object modeling in this space and maybe the lack of appreciation of people's different approaches is important here. But we also work in environments in the social sciences where my metadata is somebody else's data. Yeah. Because people might be analyzing methods or whatever else. So I think that there is a tension between the academic perspective on metadata as a separate thing and digital object modeling to build an infrastructure. Yeah. In this case, it very specifically is when you delete all the rest, there needs to be some sort of structured metadata statement left behind. So I think that one is pretty clear. But I think you're right. There is really a need to do more work on this. I think that the EOSC PID task force and PID policy are kind of struggling with some of this at the moment. Yeah. How you differentiate between the metadata that's held by, say, DataCite versus the copy of that metadata that's held locally on a landing page or a catalog page versus that stuff that's hidden in the digital object itself. There are multiple tiers to look at. So yes, is the simple answer.
Thank you.
Oh, I can see a hand, but I'll leave you to steer. Ollie, I can't see everyone.
Yeah, so Maggie has her hand raised. So Maggie, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that one man's metadata is another man's data in many cases, because it's a lot about granularity and how you sort of artificially divide the two things between there and that. But that also opens up a very interesting issue in who is it that has the responsibility for maintaining the correctness and not just that it's there, the metadata about the data object, but that it is still correct and that it is updated if required and things like that. And that is an unsolved thing, because it's of course extremely dependent on the actual situation that you're in. Who is funding what, who is responsible for what? Is it a major organization that is hosting a repository or a catalog, or is it divided up or federated across smaller entities which may have very different life horizons, so to speak? So I think that's something that needs to be taken into account here. I also put a question or a comment in the chat regarding this sort of status of being trusted, which if you're depending on getting a certification that is formal, that may lapse after some period of time, and then especially smaller repositories may be really struggling to keep that certification going because they don't have the necessary funding, for instance, to do it or whatever. Just a final thing, because Hervé was alluding to this PID policy group in the European Open Science Cloud. So I'm part of that discussion group or expert group that is dealing with that. And we can, of course, only, when we're talking about the persistent identifiers, that's really a very small subset of metadata. And it's worrying that some people seem to think that they can just dump all the metadata about their objects into the DataCite catalog, but that's not at all configured or designed to hold the details about the contents of a dataset, for instance. It's really good about the general administrative metadata for the object, but not about its contents. And I think we need to really go out and educate researchers much more about what this weird metadata thing is, and how we can, that it really has these different components, and the components have to be treated differently at repository level, at catalog level, etc. Just my 2 cents.
Great, cheers, Maggie. I'm going to let Martin jump back in there, but I will say a very quick point. In terms of this, yes, the responsibility is unclear. I think that having transparent levels of repository responsibility at that level and having granular information about the object is a necessary precursor to Martin's point about saying this is not all one lump. So who is responsible for what is critically important. The level of responsibility is vital. But I think that does need to be drilled down into something that's a lot more granular than we currently do about right statements and about actors. But that means that people take clear and transparent responsibility, which is kind of the theme here. You've mentioned also the dependency on certification. I don't know of any of the certification bodies that is suggesting that certification should be a requirement for inclusion in anything. I know that through the CoreTrustSeal, we've worked actively against that. The idea is to provide a certification service, but not to be exclusionary. Like fair trust should be a journey and we should help people reach it. And certification could be seen as the cherry on top. Apart from maybe circumstances where you need really strong criteria for things like interoperability or information security and information protection. So I think those are both good points. Thank you. Martin, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification on the metadata. I think we are pretty much on the same page here. So, and I don't want to go further into this. It's a meeting of its own, I would say. But one comment to Maggie about the trustworthiness. I do think that if nobody bothers to renew a certificate and or there's no interest of the institution in renewing it, that it should mean a slight dent in the trustworthiness. Of course, what researchers do in the end is what decides. It's not the certificate itself. But I would say that if you once applied and you deem this important to say have CTS or whatever, and then your organization decides you don't need it anymore, you don't want it anymore, that should say something. Maybe not an awful lot, but something. Thanks.
Yeah, I think Maggie's got a hand up, so we're going to let her jump in again on this discussion point, and then we'll move on because there's some other questions in the chat and preservation that we'd like to cover. So Maggie, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, just a very quick response to that. I think the transparency part here is the key, that if a repository keeps those kinds of responses to those questions or criteria that you have, for instance, for CTS certification, if you openly display this kind of information so that anyone can access it at any time and or audit it, then I think that's really goes very far towards sort of showing that you are still trustworthy, even if you do not have the money to pay for the actual the fee for being assessed.
Yeah, and that's an active point on the Fair Impact project as well, elsewhere, which is, you know, how you make the repository the owner and the sharer of its own repository level metadata. So thanks very much for that, Maggie. Sorry, Ali, go on.
Yeah, so earlier in the session, Stephen asked when you were discussing the different levels of preservation, what would you consider a minimum viable level of preservation to make a repository trusted?
So this is really interesting. So I'm not a huge fan of the trust word in the first place. It's becoming inescapable in the things that I'm working on. I think that it can be very emotive. Yeah. So one of the ideas behind CoreTrustSeal is that it was specifically there to look at active long-term preservation. Maggie shared the OAIS reference model in the links in the chat as well, and is right that a lot of these things remain highly relevant, yeah, in terms of the responsibilities. But not every one of those repositories, and repositories could be anyone looking after, in our context, anyone looking after a digital object of any kind of relevance to research anywhere. Yeah. The question is, can you trust them to look after it in the broader sense? But some things don't need to be actively preserved. They are what they are, and they will never need to be changed, or they are of low value. But other things may need to be preserved despite the fact that they are low quality because they are the only one, or because it would cost an absolute fortune to recreate them at a higher level of quality. There is no one size fits all for this, which is why I like the transparency thing, yeah, and the visibility thing. Minimum viable level depends on the value of the object, and that value of the object is assigned by a group of people, including its creators, its users, its funders, and its repository. So sometimes retention is plenty. Yeah. Sometimes when you've got very stable objects, then maybe initial curation is enough that they can be brought up to a given FAIR standard. But sometimes in a rapidly shifting world where the needs of users are changing and vocabularies and ontologies and descriptions and understandings and methods are changing really fast, I think that things are going to get very unfair very quickly unless there's an expert there to take care of them. We'll talk about the upcoming projects, hopefully just before we go, but I think that this will be a hot topic in upcoming projects. We certainly need to look at what the minimum acceptable criteria are, but not everything needs to be actively preserved forevermore. The interesting thing here is I want to know how the objects are being looked after, and if they're not being looked after well enough, maybe they could go somewhere else and be looked after better there. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think you've touched on something that Falco and Joy were discussing in the chat as well about the fact that different data and different types of data might have different preservation requirements. There was another question as well from Falco. Should we distinguish between trusted repositories and trusted archives? I think that was discussed a little bit in the chat.
I have intentionally, so, I mean, to me, yeah, I mean, I love a good definitional conversation. I could spend all afternoon on one and often have, but to me, if you can drill down to, I think the necessary thing is not to find a definition that everyone will agree on. It's to drill down to the level of responsibility in a little bit more granularity so that we can do that transparently. I'd spent a long time on the preservation task force looking at repositories versus archives. It didn't produce the perfect outcome. Yeah, we felt we needed to delve into a little bit more detail. It's just someone with digital objects that I need, and I need to know how they're looking after them, whether they'll be there tomorrow. And I think Joy raised a question of changing value over time. For retention, I want to know if they're there today, will they still be there tomorrow? And if somebody changes, makes a decision about something, will that level of care change and how? So whether it's in something you call an archive, a repository, a library, a business information system, is in some ways less relevant to me because I've needed stuff from all those places. Hope that's a fair response.
Yeah, and there was one more discussion point from Katharina. Is this concept model intended specifically for repositories, or is it also targeted at databases developed by the research community? E.g., in biology, those model organism databases that are internationally established and have been around for many years, or is that an irrelevant difference in terminology? I have not got a good marker where that question arose from, which slide.
Okay.
So
okay, it's fine. We go back to Martin's point about object modeling and what will be a very hot topic. Our email address is on the front of this. Do email me about this because we're going to have to jump off in a second. This is a hugely interesting topic in terms of the difference between an object, a catalog, a collection, and an organization, and where those responsibilities lie, and whether or not this applies equally to Martin's point. Again, the difference between data and metadata. How is a registry not like a repository? Yeah, these are all really active questions. And on that note, I'm going to hit the last slide, if that's okay, Ollie. We will get back to any other questions that are in here. Thank you very much. That was excellent. You can see my last slide on future engagement, Ollie, can you?
Yeah, last slide showing.
Brilliant. So if we're looking at making repository service offerings and digital object care levels more transparent, there is plenty going on. I've already mentioned before that a lot of those DROG things will have active RDA groups in the TRUS principles. Have got active RDA groups. They're all worth looking up and joining and contributing to. The types of repository from CoreTrustSeal is actively looking for feedback. There's a Zenodo link and an open comment forum for that. And especially to drill down a little bit more, that working paper, that's from me, but also colleagues Mari Klimola in FSD Finland and my colleague Jonas Recker at GESIS in Germany have kind of pulled that together based on the levels. It would be amazing to get a little bit more detailed thought on that from people. There is an RDA maintenance group on the CoreTrustSeal revisions. and an EOS retention task force kicking off now about retention over time. So the Fair Impact project will continue to work on this, and in the new year, the Fidelis and Eden projects will be looking at respectively trusted repository networks and preservation sort of criteria and practices. So there will be much more to see. Apologies for anything I've missed. Thank you very much for everyone's attention, and we'll get to anything we've missed at some point in the next week or so. Cheers. And thanks to Martin. I think you, Maggie, as well, for some great comments.
Thanks for the great presentation.
Cheers, Martin. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for the workshop. Bye-bye.
Bye.